most recently has focused on the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a Philadelphia journalist who has been on death row for over 30 years, in my opinion, completely unjustly for the alleged killing of a Philadelphia police officer. And she will be talking, of course, about the Young Lords in the 1970s, but some of the urban issues that led Mumia to become a crusading radio journalist and to have Frank Rizzo's police department have an eye on him, which culminated in his arrest in 1981. Those issues probably play out in Philadelphia just as some of the issues of the Young Lords and Black Panthers played out in the 1970s here in the city of New York. So Dr. Fernandez welcomes questions on those topics as well as the Young Lords. She currently is finishing up, or maybe is the book already done?
No, it's finishing up.
Finishing up a book on the Young Lords. We all look very much forward to the book, but before that, we get to hear from her in person. Dr. Fernandez.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank Professor Maripol and Professor Markowitz for the invitation. Before we start, I'd like to ask all of you guys to come to the front of the room because I'm really lonely up here in the front. It's a little difficult for me to give this 40-minute talk with the, to the empty seats. So, all the way in the front would be great, especially since it's a formal talk, so. Okay. That's the front of the room. Wow. I thought that you guys wouldn't be as intransigent as my students at Baruch. Isn't this school all about law and order? Okay. Oh, good. Good. That's healthy. Okay. So. Let me just, I'm giving a formal talk, but it's a class, so let me ask a question. Has anyone in this class heard about the Young Lords? Show of hands. And can anyone tell me what comes to mind, or what do you know about the Young Lords? Anyone? Excuse me? Okay, radicals, Latinos. Grassroots, okay, this is phenomenal. Yes. Revolution, anyone else? Yes. Okay, well, you guys have a pretty good understanding of the Young Lords and their intervention around urban ecology, absolutely. They're known for their muckraking and for their activist work around lead poisoning amongst children, sanitation. But I think the Young Lords are important because when we think about the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement in the 60s and 70s, we tend to associate that struggle with African Americans in particular. And part of what the narrative and story of the Young Lords suggest is that the movements of the 60s against discrimination were quite complex. They were quite multi-ethnic and multiracial, and they were at core concerned with issues of class. So the study of the Young Lords is important because it really expands our understanding of these movements. And only when we look at the movements as they happened in all of their complexity and with all of their ethnic diversity will we understand the true significance and impact and importance of these movements for 20th century American history. When we don't look at them in their complexity, we actually don't really get a sense of how all people and all areas of society were transformed. But you folks seem to have read something about the organization. Hopefully you read some of the articles. Did I send you any articles? Okay, wonderful, great. So what am I going to try to do in this talk? Okay, I'm going to briefly discuss the emergence of the Young Lords as an organization, but in terms of the politics of the organization. I'm going to give a sense of how the group operated on the ground, and I'm going to try to illustrate the connections between the deep and unprecedented social and economic changes that were taking place in northern cities in the period after World War II. So the connections between the political economy of the city and the transformation of the city in the post-war period, and the politics of the organizations that emerged, like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers. So my objective really is to do two things and narrate two stories together that are usually narrated separately. So my objective is to tie political economy with social history. And I think that what is happening on the ground economically, demographically, in New York and in Chicago and in LA is going to give birth to the radical movements of the 60s and 70s. Really of the late 60s and mostly the 70s, because the Young Lords really are in this interstitial place right at the beginning of the 70s. So the Young Lords organization was a radical political group that first emerged in Chicago in the late 1960s. How do I do this? Okay, great, perfect. They were heavily influenced by the politics and protest style of the Black Panther Party. So what's fascinating, however, about this picture, this photograph, is that this is the office of the Young Lords. And in fact, this gentleman here looks like a Black Panther Party, but he's a Young Lord. And he's got that beret that he's wearing that you don't see is purple, which was the color adopted by the Young Lords. But this is a black and white photograph. So a little contradiction here, right? The organization was led by first and second generation Puerto Rican radicals who were raised on the mainland of the United States rather than on the island. And the members of the organization were youth who were, as you know, radicalized by the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s. And their outlook was shaped by the social and economic crises that began to grip northern cities in the post-war period. So even though you're learning about the 1970s, in order to understand what's going on in the 70s, you really have to look at the antecedents of this period. And a lot of my talk is going to focus on what about the post-war period gave rise to what we see happening in the 1970s, that matures in the 1970s. So before, this is one of my favorite photographs. So we see here two different generations, right? An older woman, and this is a young lord who's selling newspapers, and who knows what she's telling him. You better, stick on the right side of the street and do the right thing, or who knows. But it's one of my favorite photographs because it really suggests that the young lords who were first and second generation Puerto Ricans, they had very close ties to the community. Many of them were born in Puerto Rico but were raised here. They were migrants, and they had a very strong sense of responsibility to their community. Before its emergence as a political organization, the Young Lords, as you might have read, was a gang that had been active in Chicago since the 1950s. In Chicago, gangs were a way of life in poor and working class neighborhoods. And gangs are a kind of social organization through which young people of all races cobbled together an identity and a sense of belonging. And I think that it's very important for us to really not project our understanding of what gangs look like today into that period. Gangs were less violent in that period than they are today. In many ways, the gangs of the 1950s can be understood as the poor man's social club. It provided a structure for benign social activities to members of the community, as well as more marginal pursuits in the form of petty crime. During economic uncertainty, when ethnic and racial tensions are often growing, local gangs fought for turf control along racial and ethnic lines. In the racially shifting neighborhoods of post-war Chicago, racial turf wars were fed generally by the influx of African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexican migrants to the city, to Chicago, right? We're talking about Chicago here. Now, this migration of previously rural people, African Americans, Puerto Ricans, and Mexicans, to the city happened at a moment when the economic structure of Chicago was changing. And this, of course, this migration amidst economic decline fueled competition for jobs. But locally, on the ground, urban renewal policies exacerbated inter-gang violence and rivalry. Urban renewal in the 1950s and 60s and 70s displaced working class families from their homes to make room for middle-class housing and business-led economic development, and I imagine you probably talked about urban renewal in this class. All of the Chicago lords I interviewed were forced to move with their families multiple times out of their neighborhoods, and they usually landed in the neighborhood down the road, which in their case was populated by Irish, Italian, and German immigrants and their descendants. So former young lords that I interviewed described in detail the brutal racial harassment they suffered because they were moving in to a block in which they were not welcomed. Generally, the young lords describe how their gang networks and activities hardened them, taught them how to fight at a very young age, and prepared them to navigate the mean streets of these unwelcoming neighborhoods. Okay, so this is the young lords, it was a gang. So what accounts for the transformation of this gang into a political organization? The primary architect of this transformation was the chairman of the gang. You probably heard of him, Jose Chacha Jimenez. The Puerto Rican gang leader turned activist was radicalized in prison, where he read the story of religious transformation told by Thomas Merton in his bestseller, Seven-Story Mountain. He also read the autobiography of Malcolm X in prison. So this was fascinating because when I interviewed Chacha Jimenez, he tells me the story of how, ultimately he's Puerto Rican, he's a cultural Catholic. He wanted to be a priest, but he was, getting into trouble. And his grandmother and his mother were on him because they wanted him to walk on the right side of the street. And so he expresses a deep sense of guilt about getting into trouble and hurting his family. And he ties this to religion and Catholicism. And so in prison, he reads the story of this this monk, Thomas Merton, and he's transformed by it, but he also reads the autobiography of Malcolm X. And these books were made available to him by a prison inmate and librarian who was a member of the Nation of Islam. So part of what we see in the young lord's story is the importance of the Nation of Islam in fact, educating and radicalizing a whole generation of prisoners. The Nation of Islam recruited in the prisons and offered prisoners a way out of crime and criminality, a kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps politics. Upon release from prison, Jimenez was targeted by a war on poverty program designed to bridge his transition from jail to civilian life. That program helped him find a job. He was also approached by one Pat Devine, a local activist with whom Jimenez had a number of antagonistic discussions, at the end of which he called her a communist. So Pat Devine approaches, she's a communist, approaches, or has communist proclivities, approaches Jimenez, who is increasingly politicized, and she wants to engage him in a conversation about activism in his neighborhood. Eventually, Pat Devine convinces Jimenez that he should join the struggle against urban renewal in the Lincoln Park section of Chicago where the Young Lords were active. At the gang. So the actions of the NOI in prison, an anti-poverty program, the conscious intervention of a seasoned local activist, Pat Devine, and the example set by the Black Panther Party, and of course the atmosphere of possibility created by the social movements of the era, combined with Jimenez's resolve, led to his politicization and led him to take on really what was a Herculean task, that of redirecting the activities of his gang into political work. Something, I associate with herding cats. So in many ways, gang members are conditioned to thinking narrowly and in a sectarian fashion about turf and protecting their own. They don't easily generalize politically from their experience. But somehow this moment made it possible for this radicalization to take place. And that radicalization and transformation of the gang didn't come easily. Jimenez describes that the process of convincing his colleagues to become political was very alienating, because he went from being a respected leader one day to being an outcast the next, ridiculed for his, quote, communist proclivities, which gives you a sense that the anti-communism of the 1950s, in fact, is bleeding into the 60s and 70s. But we don't necessarily hear about that in the literature. In fact, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King were called communists. But that's another story. So then finally one night, a group of 5 young lords witnessed the fatal shooting of one of their members by an undercover police officer. That night, the 5 young lords were arrested. Jimenez, who was not present at the shooting, was the first person they called from prison. And that was a turning point. It seemed to them at that moment that, in fact, organization and politics could help them get out of the situation in which they were in. They had been arrested following the shooting of one of their own. In the weeks and months that followed, and in consultation with Black Panther leader Fred Hampton, Jimenez proceeded to turn the Young Lords into a political organization comparable to the Black Panther Party. Because of their already existing gang network, hundreds of young men and women joined the Young Lords organization and partook in their militant neighborhood protests against urban renewal. Before long, the Young Lords, as you know, became known for organizing militant, media-savvy, community-based protest campaigns against inadequate health care, dilapidated housing, as we see here, against hunger, lead poisoning, and tuberculosis among poor city residents, and irregular sanitation services. This is important here because this is an interview with Chacha Jimenez that appears in the Black Panther newspaper. And young college students at SUNY Old Westbury, who are multi-ethnic and come from all kinds of different walks of life, are going to read the Black Panther newspaper and come across this article about the Young Lords in Chicago. And that night, they determined that they're going to drive from SUNY Old Westbury in New York to Chicago to meet Cha-Cha Jimenez. And here, Cha-Cha talks about his radicalization. He talks about the importance of Cuba and Che Guevara to the struggle for Puerto Rican independence. Okay, and this is some of the protests that, that these young people lead here in East Harlem around the garbage, right? They collect the garbage in the neighborhood and pile it up in the middle of the street, and then it gets burned by people in the neighborhood, and that stops traffic. And this is covered in hundreds, dozens of articles in mainstream papers like the New York Times. Here's their tuberculosis testing door to door. And they did an enormous amount of work around health, and this is their 10-point health program, which is quite fascinating. It pretty much establishes that healthcare is a right, not a privilege, and it criticizes the turn that healthcare is turning in the in the post-war period. In 1969, ex-student radicals who had previously been active in local student struggles and in the civil rights and Black Power movements launched a branch of the YLO in New York. And eventually, there was a break between the Chicago Young Lords and the New York Young Lords. I don't have time really to go into the reasons why the organizations split. It was more or less a cordial split, but what ended up emerging was the Young Lords Party here in New York. And they set up branches in the Bronx, in Brooklyn, the Lower East Side, Newark, Hartford, and Philadelphia, amongst other places. So the rest of my talk is going to focus really on the organization that emerges here in New York. And I want to give you a sense of the fast pace of activism that these young people engaged in a very short period of time between 1969 and, say, 1971, 72, 73. So the first thing they launched was what they called the Garbage Offensive, a campaign protesting irregular sanitation services in East Harlem, and they also were protesting the absence of public trash bins in that neighborhood. They called attention to the crisis of sanitation by sweeping the streets and clearing empty lots and erecting traffic barriers at major intersections with the garbage they collected, as I mentioned previously. Their demonstrations were covered heavily by the media in the summer of 1969 and contributed to making sanitation a major issue in the run-up to the mayoral election of that November. They exposed the city for not deeming Puerto Ricans and African Americans worthy of city services. And I think it's important to note that today New York is a relatively clean city. But in the 70s and the 60s, the city was a mess. There were carcasses of cars everywhere, and mattresses strewn in the middle of the street. And there were rats everywhere. Brooklyn mothers protested against rat infestation in 1967. So garbage was a really big problem in the city, and it was an even bigger problem in poor neighborhoods in the Bronx and in East Harlem. Their other offensive was the lead offensive. In collaboration with medical residents, nurses, and hospital staff at Metropolitan Hospital in East Harlem, the Young Lords launched what is now known as a door-to-door drive to test children for lead poisoning. They used press conferences to publicize their findings. And their findings were pretty alarming, that 30% of the children they tested were lead positive. They called sit-ins at the Department of Health, they leafleted in East Harlem, and used the media to expose government inaction. And in 1974, the Journal of Public Health credited the Young Lords and their activism with the passage of anti-lead poisoning legislation in the city. This was the first campaign in what became the Young Lords' crusade for medical rights for poor African American, Latino, and Asian city dwellers. In December 1969, they took over a church and turned it into a social service sanctuary for the poor. And they used everything at their disposal to illustrate their cause. And this is probably one of my favorite quotes from the Young Lords. It was something that Juan Gonzalez, who now writes for the Daily News and is co-host of the Democracy Now! Radio show with Amy Goodman. He was a student at Columbia who was involved in the protest there in 1968, and then was sought out by the students at SUNY Old Westbury to join in their organization. And this is what he said at this press conference around the time that they took over the church. And this clinic, which they set up with doctors, was in the basement of the church. This is what he says, quote, "People who claim to be Christian have forgotten that it was Jesus who walked among the poor, the most oppressed, the prostitutes, and drug addicts of his time. That it was Jesus who said that it was easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven." So again, the Young Lords are using their backgrounds and the religion of their parents really to make an argument around the revolutionary character of Jesus Christ. And they shamed local churches for turning a blind eye to misery and poverty. Then in the summer of 1970, they did the unthinkable and occupied Lincoln Hospital with the blessing of a radical flank of doctors at the hospital. The Young Lords' occupation dramatized Lincoln's deplorable conditions, the whirlwind of controversy at the hospital following their occupation was recorded in over 100 mainstream and alternative news articles, and government officials were forced to find ways to improve care in the city's public hospitals. The Young Lords' actions eventually led to the creation of one of the principal acupuncture drug treatment centers in the Western world at Lincoln Hospital. Here's their breakfast program that they served, organized at the church. And this is one of the photographs outside of Lincoln Hospital. And here we see their 7 demands. And part of what they're doing is that they're exposing the crisis in the emergency room at Lincoln, the drug addiction that is now rampant in the Bronx in the 70s. But they're also calling for a minimum wage of $140 for all workers. So they're really combining community issues with issues of labor. And here, this is their clothing drive. They're calling for a socialist society. So what did they stand for? And here we get into the politics. They were self-proclaimed revolutionary nationalists who argued for Puerto Rican independence and fought against Puerto Rican oppression, both in the U.S. mainland, but also poverty in general. They were nationalists because they believed that in order to fight oppression, Puerto Ricans needed to form their own separate organizations. They argued that in order to combat the psychological effects of racism, Puerto Ricans needed to build confidence amongst themselves by organizing their own ethnic-based leadership. The contradiction about their Puerto Rican nationalism, however, was that 30% of the membership was African American and non-Puerto Rican Latino. So this is fascinating, right? I interviewed one member of the organization and I asked him, his name is Panama Alba, you might know him or have heard about him. He's Panamanian, hence the name. And I asked him, you know, Panama, what were you doing in the Young Lords organization, a Puerto Rican nationalist organization in New York, if you're a Panamanian? And he said, well, you have to understand that this was a revolutionary moment when solidarity was the word in these movements. And I was living in the epoch of the Cuban Revolution and the leadership of Che Guevara in that revolution, an Argentine who fights in the Cuban Revolution. And one of the most important struggles in the United States was to fight against the colonialism that it had deployed in Puerto Rico. And as a revolutionary, I knew that that was one of the important struggles of that time. The premise of their revolutionary politics was socialist in nature. In other words, they believed that society would not be organized, should not be organized on the basis of profit, but rather around human priorities and needs. These anti-capitalists were influenced by variants of Marxism, Maoism, theories of revolution that emerged out of the national independence struggles that were happening all over the world, in Africa and Asia, and the ideas of the father of Puerto Rican nationalism, Don Pedro Albizu Campos. So what led to the adoption of radical politics by this section of Puerto Ricans? How exactly was it that such a large number of young people held radical, dissenting, revolutionary ideas, but in fact decided to organize themselves and organize those ideas? Part of what I argue in my work is that the riots were the single development that most influenced the emergence of northern urban radicalism in the 1970s. In 1966, over 24 cities went up in flames. That same year, Puerto Ricans rioted in Chicago. And one day before the Detroit riots of 1967, Puerto Ricans rioted in East Harlem. Again, we tend to think of the riots of the late 1960s as a predominantly African-American phenomenon, but what we haven't studied and read is about how other people of color, Mexicans in LA, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans in Chicago, and Puerto Ricans in New York and Philadelphia also rioted. The Puerto Rican riots of 1967 were Puerto Rican in nature. The urban riots were a bold reminder of the class divisions in American society. These rebellions were a raw manifestation of the anger and political disenchantment possessed by racial minorities in the post-war North. They dramatized the conditions of racial apartheid, unemployment, inferior education, housing, and medical care in northern cities. The riots express this sentiment, that racial and economic inequality in the North was a structural feature of American society that required fundamental change, and that nothing short of a full-scale rebellion would bring about an equitable social order. In many ways, this logic of the rebellions was right. While in the South, white supremacists were at the helm of a renegade and anachronistic system of racial segregation that was marginal to the American political and economic structure and therefore could be defeated. In the North, problems were more structural and entrenched in the very fabric of the system and therefore required changes of revolutionary proportion. After World War II, northern cities became more segregated by race and more divided by class than ever before in the history of the cities. How did this happen? First, World War II encouraged a mass migration of people of color into the cities because during the war, the economy was cranked up at maximum capacity for the war effort. So African Americans from the South, Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico, Mexicans from Mexico, and Chicanos and Native Americans from the Southwest traveled to northern cities in search of wartime jobs. The process of suburbanization, which happened simultaneously, encouraged the departure of whites from the cities. In many ways, the urbanization and proletarianization of these otherwise rural people gave them confidence, improved their wages, and gave them a sense of their power in numbers. This migration to the cities led to the rise of the civil rights movement. In the case of Puerto Ricans, the transfer of more than 1/3 of Puerto Rico's population to New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia between 1943 and 1960 engendered a unique generation of mainland-identified Puerto Rican youth. As sons and daughters of post-war migration, their consciousness was shaped by an unlikely combination of politicizing experiences, from the rise of the civil rights movement and the Vietnam War to their own experiences in an urban setting beset by industrial decline and greater economic and racial segregation. So the convergence of Puerto Rican migration with the rise of the civil rights movement in particular had a profound impact on the racial consciousness of the children of Puerto Rican migrants. Among other developments, this process gave birth to an organization with the kind of politics held by the Young Lords Party, which would insist that Puerto Ricans and African Americans shared common political and economic interests. However, with the end of the war came a long-term process of structural changes in the economy of northern cities. A process of deindustrialization took hold, which created a sizable class of permanently unemployed and discouraged young workers, a completely new development in modern urban history.